Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape the community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
Religion offers people of faith many things, including support and a sense of community. But for LGBTQ+ people, their relationship with religion, specifically Christianity, can be difficult. Trying to live authentically in a system that may explicitly deny who they are can present challenges. This piqued the interest of a couple Marquette University professors who researched what happens when two identities that seem in total opposition are joined together. Dawne Moon and Theresa Tobin explore how LGBTQ+ Christians and their allies are working to make their families, churches, and communities more inclusive in their book, Choosing Love. To talk about the book and the people who helped shape it, Moon and Tobin joined Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski.
You both worked on this book, Choosing Love. So can you start us off by introducing yourselves and sharing how you both came together to start this unique research back in 2014?
So I'm a sociologist who has been studying religion and gender and sexuality since the 1990s. And I started this project when I first heard about the movement among evangelical LGBTQ+ people when my partner's cousin, who was evangelical, came out, and other people in his immediate family were trying to figure out how they should respond, and approached me and asked what I thought was the proper Christian response to homosexuality, which I thought was a odd thing for him to be asking me at the time since I'm not religious. But he knew that I studied it, and we started swapping articles. And from him, I learned that these organizations had started up and that this movement was happening. And it just seemed like everything that I had been studying in my life up to that point had come together. Because in addition to being interested in how U.S. Protestants were navigating questions around gender and sexuality, I had also been taking some time studying dialogue, and particularly the Jewish-Palestinian dialogue movement. And so here was dialogue happening among conservative Protestants talking about sexuality and gender. And I just, I was like, I have to figure out what's going on here. I was really curious and really fascinated. And then I had the opportunity to apply for a grant from the Templeton Religion Trust that required me to work with someone in the humanities. And I remembered that Theresa had done research on spiritual violence and seemed like a good partner for the project.
Yeah, so Theresa, can you share a bit more about your background and the lens that you brought to this?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm a moral philosopher. I work primarily in contemporary ethics and social philosophy from a feminist perspective. And I've always been interested in ethical questions that arise at the intersection of people's faith experiences and spirituality and gender and sexuality. And both from a philosophical perspective, but also a personal perspective. I'm Roman Catholic, and I grew up with a background and lots of questions around that intersection. And in 2010, I started to read testimony from survivors of the clergy sexual abuse crisis. And a lot of them were naming spiritual violence as a harm of that form of abuse that was not getting a lot of attention. So the idea of spiritual violence, when your religion and your religious upbringing and authorities and rituals and practices are actually used to harm people spiritually and to erect barriers to their relationship with God. And I was so impacted by that term. And I just thought, I want to study that more. But then also seeing connections between what women and LGBTQ plus folks in Christian communities and Catholic communities in particular were also naming as kind of spiritual harm. So when Dawne approached me, I saw these connections and I was like, oh, I'm doing this thing by myself. But when Dawne approached me with this grant opportunity that, gave birth to a whole new research project and trajectory.
Right. And this research is based on interviews that you've conducted with people in the Midwest, across the nation, who are part of groups that are trying to figure out this intersectionality. So can you explain in a little more detail the methodology of the interviews for your book and what groups that you worked with to find people willing to talk about this topic?
Yeah, so we started by going to discussion groups. The organization was called the Marin Foundation, and they had these discussion groups called the Living in the Tension gatherings, where people would come and just, have a topic of the week and talk about questions they had, experiences they'd had, share their stories. And it was really about just, people trying to figure out how they should move forward. Sometimes pastors would come who were trying to figure out, like, okay, so what I'm hearing from maybe someone in my congregation or someone that I know about the effects of how the church has approached questions around sexuality and gender is not bearing the good fruit that Jesus said good teachings should bear. Or LGBTQ plus conservative Christians would go and, just be like, can I exist? How, where can I live? How can I be? And from that, I learned about other organizations and, we would go to national conferences. And so we're meeting people where they are, watching them have the conversations they're actually having, as opposed to sort of more of a kind of a lab approach where you're taking people out of the context of their lives. And so then when we asked people if they'd like to be interviewed, we were starting that interview from the shared experience of like, oh, so, we were having this conversation. Can you say more about what brought you there? Can you say more about how you got to be where you are today? And just hearing about their thought processes, their experiences, what's their story.
Yeah, and I want to lay out some basic definitions for the listeners related to our conversation and this book. And let's start with the phrase welcoming but not affirming. Can you explain what this means in regard to Christian communities?
Yeah, I can try. So in some Christian spaces, people will say that they are welcoming of LGBTQ plus people, meaning those people are permitted to come to celebrate in the liturgy, to sometimes maybe even participate in ministry, lead the music ministry, be part of the community in that sense. But not affirming then means that the official position of the church is that we don't acknowledge or accept or affirm or celebrate that you are gay or lesbian or transgender. So we're not affirming or accepting your sexuality or your gender identity as something to acknowledge, recognize, and celebrate. But we're still saying that's sinful, but you're welcome to be here. We're all sinners. We're all on a journey, and you're welcome to be here and be part of our community. So that's how I've understood that.
Yeah, and this kind of touches upon the whole idea of conditional love that you explore. And as you were saying before, Dawne, these groups are helping people try to understand, like, how do I fit into this place, right? So with this book and the lens that you viewed it in, how do you both define or characterize conservative LGBTQ Christians? Because from an outside perspective, if someone's not practicing or not familiar, a lot of people could assume that this is a bit of an oxymoron, right?
Yeah, I would say that they're conservative Christians in that they use conservative Christian techniques of interpreting the Bible. They tend to be part of conservative Christian culture. Conservative Christian music is the music that speaks to them. They may have, some conservative Christian denominations or independent churches basically teach people ways to channel the Holy Spirit or to have their own conversations with God. And that's formed them. That's who they are. And they're gay, bi, trans, queer. And so a lot of times, and we have encountered this even among other academics, where we say we're talking about the LGBTQ conservative Christian movement, and people are just like, well, that can't exist. The only thing that defines whether you're conservative or not is your stance on gender and sexuality in that case. But that basically is not the foundation of their Christianity. The foundation of their Christianity is their relationship with Jesus. Right? And so the idea that your ideas or your understanding of gender and sexuality would erase all of that seems to give a lot of power to gender and sexuality, right? And a lot of power to these social constructions as opposed to people's relationship with the divine.
to kind of navigate this big water, right, of this area of study, the people you're talking to, you do focus on the significance of 4 emotions in the lives of LGBTQ plus Christians, which is shame, humility, pride, and love. And I'm hoping you both can share some sentiments that you heard over and over from people you interviewed, like some common themes. What are some of the main struggles or some of the main things that are bringing them together?
One thing that started to become clear pretty early on was that an LGBTQ plus person had to constantly be displaying shame in order to be welcome in the group. And so we spent a lot of time looking at so what is shame? It came up all the time. People were really trying to figure out how to navigate it. And scholars across a whole lot of disciplines, philosophy, psychology, sociology, theology, right? They all come down to the idea of shame being a fear of being unworthy of relationships. And so if you're having to constantly demonstrate to the people who matter most to you that you're unworthy of relationships in order for them to be willing to have a relationship with you and not just throw you out, then you're in this very difficult position where you're having to just constantly be like, I feel like they love me, but they don't love me. And I love them, but they don't want me too close to them because they think my capacity to love is dangerous to the people that I love. And, a number of people were told, you can't be around kids, or you can't lead worship, or you can't help people with the dance ministry, or whatever it is, because your sin could infect them, right? Or your sin could lead them to a place of doubt, and we can't have that. And that, constantly being told your capacity to love other people is dangerous. It just really led to a lot of the psychological distress and, feeling like life was not livable for a lot of people.
Before we continue, I'm just going to take a moment to reintroduce you both. If you're just joining us on Lake Effect, I'm Audrey Nowakowski, speaking with Dawne Moon and Theresa Tobin, authors of Choosing Love. Their book explores how people can identify as both LGBTQ plus and conservative Christians. So one of the ways you examined how people came out of the other side of this sacramental shame that we were just talking about is through the unique lens of pride. So can you explain to me what you guys are looking at when it comes to pride in this community that's different from a typical Christian lens?
Yeah, I'll start with this one. And I can't talk about pride without talking about humility in this context. So I think for one of the things that's really important about what we learned was the connection between humility and pride. So a lot of the folks we talked to were taught from very, very early on that pride is a sin and that it's one of the deadliest sins, maybe the root of all sin, because they equate pride with arrogance, with sort of elevating yourself above God. And so pride was and is, and a lot of people talked about pride being something that could never be explored, let alone felt. So what we learned from folks was, for many, many people, the first step to healing seems to come through a kind of humility, which is an openness and prioritize what we can learn from our relationships to rethink ourselves and rethink what we know, or at least ask questions about it. And that led many people to experience a kind of a sense of their own fundamental goodness and worthiness. And that's the kind of pride we're talking about. So pride, relational pride, is a kind of confidence and joy in your basic human worthiness, that you're just worthy for love and relationship. It's not elevating you above anyone. It's just a basic sense of your own worthiness. And it's an emotion that I think a lot of people whose dignity isn't regularly called into question, whose existence isn't regularly called into question, take for granted. But for people who are routinely diminished, to be able to feel your own worthiness and to feel joy in that is pride. That's what people were experiencing, that sense of like, wait a minute, I'm worthy of love and connection, period. It's my birthright too.
So with this lens of humility leading to openness, more relationships, deeper understanding, what does allyship look like to you in this lens?
Yeah, so being an ally also starts from a place of humility, right? Like what Theresa is talking about with humility is letting go of the arrogance to say, I already know everything there is to know. And so to be an ally means you have to listen to the people that you want to be an ally to. And you might have to change something about yourself in order to be an ally. And maybe that thing about yourself is like your understanding of your privileged place in the world, that God loves you best, right? Maybe it's just rethinking what you've always known, right? But being open to like, okay, I'm going to, we talked to, or, we heard from one person who spoke at a conference, conservative Christian dad of a young gay man who was like, I'm gay. And he was like, okay, well, I don't want to jeopardize my relationship with my son. But, obviously this is not okay. He's not going to be able to like get married one day, but we're going to study the Bible together, and then he'll see for himself that this isn't possible. And so they studied the Bible together and they got all the books and the concordances and they did a real deep dive over months. And the dad was like, oh, I actually didn't realize all this. I had just assumed that what I knew was fine and right, and I don't have to think about it. But now I'm thinking about it, and I'm realizing I was wrong. And so that allyship comes from both, listening to the people that you want to be an ally to, loving them enough to actually learn from them, and connect with them in a way that you can be transformed by your connection, and not speaking for them, right? You've got to listen to them and amplify their voices, but also be open to learning new things.
As authors diving into this topic, who do you feel is the audience for this book, or who do you ideally want to reach? That's a question that we thought about a lot, particularly with our editor. And on the one hand, there's an audience of people who have been in this situation, right? Who have been, part of these movements, or who, like people who now characterize themselves as ex-evangelical, who feel like they're survivors of some of the more toxic practices that they've experienced in evangelical churches. And finding words for the experiences that they've had has been really helpful for a lot of people. So that's great. But not being a religious person myself, I really hope that people like me will want to read it too. Like, I'm queer. I left the church as soon as I could, basically. And what I learned from this movement is not just about like how to be a better Christian, right? It's about like the things that are really easy for me as an outsider to see as toxic dynamics are also toxic dynamics that exist within the left. And I hope that more than just the people that the book is specifically about will want to read it, because I think that they, this is a group of people who practice saying things really well, who think really deeply about big questions, and who, work to, put their ideas and their love into bringing other people along on the path. And that path is sometimes liberating and life affirming, and you don't have to convert religions to learn from them. And for you, Theresa?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Dawne shared. I have similar feelings about who I hope will read this. I think one of the most powerful messages that kind of goes beyond the narrow group that we learned from and heard from is, what does it mean for love to be politically and morally motivating? When we say we want to love people that are not in our families or our friends, like, what does that mean? What does that look like? How can I engage in a love ethic and a love politics that's really aimed at justice? Like, what's the relationship between those two? So anyone who cares about that question, I think, can learn something from the book, can learn something from their stories, because they're trying to enact that and are having some success. And so that's not a new theme. That's a theme that activists and thinkers have talked about for a long time, but it's a contemporary iteration and practical movement of people trying to enact that. And they have some unique insight given their vantage point and their perspective and their place in contemporary American politics and society.
Well, Dawne and Theresa, I want to thank you both so much for joining me today to talk more about choosing love.
Thank you so much for having us. This has been a delight.
Dawne Moon is the Director of Interdisciplinary Gender and Sexuality Studies at Marquette University. Theresa Tobin is an Associate Professor of Philosophy at Marquette. Together, they're the co-authors of Choosing Love, What LGBTQ Christians Can Teach Us All About Relationships, Inclusion, and Justice. They spoke with Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.